broadly ready to go? I can't even see you without my glasses. Yes, people are nodding. So we're going to go to the first question and then see what happens. So first question is, on a scale of 1 to 5, oh, I always want to do something like that. On a scale of 1 to 5. So 5 is extremely confident, 1 is not at all. How confident are you in your finance function in terms of sustainability, their understanding of and interest in sustainability? If you could vote now, please. And do I have forgotten? Do I need to? Okay, shall I click on it then? Yeah. There we go. You've got that exciting countdown. Time's almost up. And we're hoping the results might come through right away, but we're not entirely sure. Now, do I need to click? Do I need to click again? I've forgotten the very basic instructions that were only explained to me about 10 minutes ago. Yeah.
They should just automatically come down.
Okay, so if I just wait for a second or two, then we'll see. Oh, is something happening? Oh, we go. It's exciting, isn't it?
Ready for the screen?
Okay, hang on. So we might need to...
Live polling can be done by...
Yeah, exactly. Shall I move on to the second question, then? I'm just looking for... I've forgotten my instructions. Yeah. Wow. So there we are. A few people absolutely not. Quite a few people, well, not so much. A few in the middle, and a few saying absolutely yes. So that's a real interesting first start, isn't it? Let's try question 2 then. On a scale of 1 to 5, how open is your finance director to well-made business cases for sustainability? So let's imagine you put together a good business case. How open are they to that business case? 1, not at all. 5, absolutely, this is their thing. If we could vote now, please, folks. Oh, that was quick, wasn't it? It's still coming through. Ah. Again, quite interesting. A few down at the not so much. Oh, it's changing. A few absolutely. About a quarter of you thinking absolutely they are open to. So that's interesting. That's good. And one last question before we get into the meat of things. On a scale of 1 to 5, how motivated are you to change your behavior to get the right result? So that was about finance. This is about you. If you have to change what you do in order to get the right result in terms of finance and influence, how prepared are you to do it? Vote now. So 1 would be absolutely not. You can't be bothered changing. 5 is you will morph in chameleon-like into anything required. And look at that, you're all chameleons. Excellent. We're going to leave that up. I'm just going to go and join Phil over here, folks. Thanks for that. Thank you very much to the man at the back. So like I say, you've already heard more from me than you really want to. I'm delighted to have Phil with us and have Phil prepared to take time out from his, I know, still busy schedule. Let me just give you a quick intro to Phil, and then we're going to kick off. So Phil is now a strategic finance consultant. He was finance director at the University of Edinburgh for 6 years, and we worked together closely, and he was a huge ally. And he joined the higher education sector in 2005 as a finance director at Heriot Watt, and prior to that he undertook a range of financial roles at Scottish and Newcastle in leased pubs, international beer, there may be a theme there, brands, marketing, contract management, strategy, finance, corporate development, and audit. In the last 5 years, Phil has led a finance transformation project in Edinburgh to improve all aspects, I would say, of the finance team and their performance. And that's been recognised in a range of awards, and I'm going to embarrass him by reading them out. So IIP Silver Award in 2014, Business Finance Award, Business Insider Scottish Accountancy and Finance Award in 2015, Time Higher Education Innovative Finance Award in 2018, shortlisted for Finance Team of the Year, and Phil was Finance Director of the Year in the year that he retired, which I think is pretty impressive achievement.
Cost a fortune to get
And it says here, and I think this is right, Phil has a particular interest in strategic finance, in sustainable investments, and in effective communication of business performance. And he's got a string of other things here, actually, that he's done, but I'm going to let them come out, I think, as part of the conversation. So, welcome, Phil.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to this. We thought we'd ask a few questions just to start things off, and then by about latest 9:30, we're going to turn to you. If you have no questions, then we're going to finish early and have a long coffee break, but I'm really hoping you have a lot of questions, because I think this is a great opportunity. So, without any further ado from me, Phil, could you just tell us a bit about your career to date, particularly latterly your role at the University of Edinburgh, and to give people a flavour of some of the responsibilities that you had and some of the big decisions that you had to take as a finance director?
Yes, well, thanks for having me here. Sustainability is not usually one of the things that is high up in the list of finance people, but I was absolutely delighted to see some of the results there. That shows that there are a lot more enlightened teams around now and people are listening. The sort of areas that I was involved in, Edinburgh University is quite a big organisation, but about £1 billion turnover this year. So there's a lot happening, and things on your agenda to compete with all the other things you're looking at, things like the capital programme. So we had about 1.2 billion to spend over the next 10 years, and trying to prioritise which project to do first was huge. I would like to have seen a lot more spent on staff development. I think we spend and put too much emphasis in the sector on the buildings and not enough on the people. I think there's a huge opportunity. For example, the bill at Edinburgh University for staff costs is about 500 million a year. So if you take, if you're looking for a change programme or a performance improvement programme that would add 5 or 10% to somebody's performance, which is not unreasonable, if you take 5%, in effect that's a 25 million per annum improvement in that asset, which is phenomenal. So I think we've got, as finance people, a little to think about to improve. Some of the big complex decisions related to sustainability, funnily enough. I mean, Dave and I spent a lot of time with the investment committee trying to work out how to not just screen out negatives. So, for example, alcohol, tobacco, not alcohol. I was just thinking of it last night. That's called a Freudian slip.
I'm not sure you did screen out last night.
Enough of that. So tobacco, and then worked our way through various things till we came on to fossil fuels. And we had a big debate about that. And that was one of the most interesting, but potentially most loaded type decisions that I was involved in the organisation, because it involved academics for and against, it involved students mostly for, not really against, and some senior admin people. And we did a lot of work on that very high profile project, and we may talk about that later. It ended up with my office being occupied for a day. It ended up with our admin office, the whole office block, being blocked off by People and Planet for about 10 days. So it was, in relative terms, the amount of spend we're looking at was relatively modest, but the impact was huge. So that's another area. And the finance transformation that Dave talked about, I really get a buzz out of seeing people improve their performance. When you explain something to somebody, they go, ah, yes, when that light goes on, that's fantastic. And that's what led to the awards for the finance team, because once you get people motivated and moving and starting to believe in themselves more, it's unstoppable. You just need to stand back and let them go. And that's that's the main reason that we got all those awards, that people became self-motivated. So those are the sort of areas. I mean, everything from capital through people development, through sustainability, and then the big IT transformation. Those are the areas where I think the university has had some of its biggest decisions that I've been involved in changing.
And can I mention, Phil, just to check, because people might not be aware, you'd also, as an FD, and it's going to be the same for most big universities, pensions issues, debt raising, cash management and treasury, are also things that fall under your... Yeah, people just may not be aware.
Yeah, the pension one is a very thorny issue, and it's not gone away yet. In fact, I think it's probably going to burst sometime soon. We've got an unaffordable, very attractive pension. Speaking of somebody who's going to be drawing on it, I can say that. So I had that conflict of interest, trying to manage a completely uncontrollable and unaffordable cost, and at the same time looking forward to accessing the benefits of it at some point.
And I guess we want to touch on that first, to give people a flavour, if you weren't aware, that there is, if you are a senior leader, particularly if you're director of finance, you've got this pretty vast range of things to be considering. So it's quite heartening, I guess, for me to see how many people thought that there were finance directors out there listening and they were willing to do what's required. But people can always, I think, I know I can always improve. So the second question we want to put to Phil is, from your point of view, what are the common pitfalls that people fall into when they're trying to get support from senior leaders like yourself, or particularly finance directors? So common pitfalls.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few. Some will be more obvious. Some colleagues think that you just need to keep coming and pestering. So if let's go and pester the FD, I need something done, I'll just keep turning up on the door, I'll buttonhole them at meetings, I'll just keep asking. So you got 5 out of 5 for persistence, but the rest of it needs a bit more work than that. Just shouting louder in meetings, just saying, you know, but you must understand. Well, persuade me, but don't shout at me. And I think one of the biggest problems, and this is not just about sustainability, colleagues, but you know, everybody, the idea that if you really believe something passionately and you know you're right and the other person just doesn't get it, that's probably not an objective analysis of the situation between you and the rest of the people in the room. The idea that you simply become completely outraged, but you must do it. I mean, how can you possibly not understand this? You're a bad person because climate change is so important and you have to do this and you have to do that. It'll only cost £10,000. It'll only cost 100,000, 10 million. I mean, you're an FD, you can afford this. Surely you're able to influence that. And it's this sort of but surely type approach. You are senior, this is so important, why do you not just get it? And eventually, when you get somebody who's been through that loop and they discover what the real approach is and the real answer, they do reflect on it and say, yes, I could have done that differently and better. And I think what colleagues don't understand is that their agenda is not the only one, or their agendum is not the only one on the FD's agenda. So I've got an example where, and I've changed the identities, so you can't work out who this was or where it was. But across my 13-year career in the higher education sector, when somebody comes to you and says, but we need a new bike scheme, you go, well, okay, convince me. And then there's this outrage and there's a rant and there's 27 pages of part narrative, a lot of screen clippings, a lot of downloads, just 30 or 40 pages of assembled bits of information. And then after some probing, you find out that this is really important for the university, or actually it's for the 27 people that need a new bike and want the tax benefit from getting that. Now I'm not against that. I think increasingly now you can see there's a huge drive towards bikes and all the rest of it. But for somebody simply to say, because 27 of us need a new bike and we want a new bike shed, oh, and by the way, we need showers in here and you'll need to change that and this access. And you say, well, hang on a minute, guys. In relative terms, I know it's important to you, but you've got to understand why I am not just dropping everything and dealing with this. So we've got a major capital programme to replace buildings where bits are falling off, killing people, potentially. Not quite, but almost. We've got an incident where there's a gas explosion. We're trying to deal with that. We've got 2 new governors who are pressurising the finance department to update the strategic plan. I've got 2 key finance colleagues off sick, and I can't replace them short term, etc., etc., etc. And then you come in and your request for a new bike has to join that list of priorities. And I think, you know, and this applies to everybody who's trying to get space in the FD's decision-making approach. Think about what you're doing relative to the organisation. How important is it relative to the organisation? How important is it, can you align what you're doing with the priorities of the organisation? Because there's a fair bet the FD will be prioritising all requests and all activity relative to delivering the strategic plan. So if the bike shed is not mentioned in the strategic plan, or it's not a subset of a massive drive to improve sustainability or whatever, then the chances of it getting a lot of airtime, decision-making, and ultimately finance is probably going to be quite low. So it's only that's a hypothetical example, but all of the bits that I mentioned in there from one or more discussions are absolutely real.
Really helpful. And just a reflection, when I was younger and I used to put in these cases into the planning round system, it's slightly mysterious, I don't know if anybody's done this, slightly mysterious process that you have to submit something to. And looking back, of course, it had no backing. It wasn't mentioned in the strategic plan. Nobody was expecting it. None of the senior people were willing to back it. But I sort of thought, well, I'm in the planning round system, I'm in the running now. And, you know, you'd look back and say, we never really were. Hey, that was just a polite way of telling you that's not going to happen, but we'll let you down gently. And so, yeah, I think the sort of things that you're saying, Phil, resonate with me. I think that takes us on nicely, and this is something covered in the Governor's Guide and the Business Guide, which is about business cases. So before we move to questions, to start getting your questions ready, just want to ask you, in your view as an experienced finance man, what are the key ingredients that make for a successful business case? What did you love to see when you're reading these business cases, because you've read a lot of them? And conversely, what did you hate to see when you're like, oh no, we've got this again? So yeah, elements of a good business case, what did you love, what did you hate?
Yeah. Does everybody know what a business case is? We'll do a non-electronic. So show of hands, who knows how to write a business case? Very good. Now, for those of you who don't know, or who are too shy to confess that you did know, there is nothing more complicated than people trying to complicate a business case and second guess what it's about. A business case is just a story. And the best part of finance, and it's why, you know, now I've retired and I'm spending more time doing other things, one of the things I'm doing is getting more involved in storytelling and helping people to think differently. Because a business case is just a really good story in a well-constructed environment with a few numbers put in for context. It has to be... most people were here yesterday when Terry Ahern was talking. Do you remember the point where he started talking about put yourself in the future? So you've got your grandchild and you're walking along the river and you come across this huge building and it's been shut down and the trees are growing through it. And I looked around, you could have heard a pin drop. And he had everybody because he'd created an expectation that there was a story coming. There was something interesting, there was something mysterious, there was something different. This wasn't just another piece of somebody standing up. There was something you wanted to know. So who was the child and what was the building? What had happened to it? Where was that mystery? And it's that ability to hook somebody in a really good story at the outset of your business case that makes the difference between one that you continue reading and one you put in the bin. And I've done both. The number of business cases I've sent back because they are just badly written, you know, poor English, is awful. I constantly berated my fabulous award-winning team because they would just focus the numbers on spreadsheets and didn't give me the narrative. I was in China last week and there was a finance guy in a small startup that I'm involved in, and he kept bringing in this sheet of paper and it just had numbers on it. No matter how often I said to him, he just came back and it was just numbers. And eventually I sent him away and I said, if you want to work here as an accountant, you need to be able to explain what you found. So all the technical stuff is great, but you need to be able to explain it. So a good business case will be one that has got a really compelling narrative. It's got a great story. The future is set out, and you know, it's not a coincidence. If the future is a fantastic thing that you've created, it probably aligns really well with where the university is going, what it's doing, what the strategic plan is. So making sure that your story will take us to a place which is where the university wants to go is, you know, it's not difficult to see why that people get more attention. So putting that story is important. Where do you want to get to? Where are you now? You know, just a step change. What are the cause and effect steps to get there? And selective use of numbers. Put in the numbers that matter. Don't put them in just because Excel allows you to put a spreadsheet with two significant digits. And I genuinely have seen spreadsheets where in 6 years' time somebody says, and the answer will be £40,731,423.04. Bollocks. I mean, utter nonsense. I mean, I've got a favourite phrase, which I use 2 or 3 times a week. Essentially, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. The future is a very uncertain place. All the projections you make will be wrong. The only question is by what degree. Is it 1%, 5%, 105%? You know, the range matters. So don't get obsessed by the greatest precision. The further out you go, the less likely you are to know what the answer is, because stuff happens. But put in a selective a set of numbers that are both non-financial and financial. There's again sort of obsession that it's finance, I don't understand finance, I get the numbers. There's a whole bunch. Some of the best business cases I saw from Dave's team had very little in the financial numbers, but absolutely huge on the metrics about carbon use, about the market positioning, the growth in alternative energy, all that sort of stuff. It was relevant metrics. So have a great story, relevant metrics, and you really will improve your hit rate.
Okay, thank you, Phil. So that's us, had our discussion, and now we want to turn it to a discussion that involves yourself. So I'm hoping that hands are about to go up, and they are, which is good. So we're going to start with Joe there, and then I saw, sorry, there was a lady there, and then we'll come to you next. So Joe first, and then there was a lady at the back, and then there's another lady there. Yep. And if people could say who they are as well.
We have a way of doing it, and now the big question is how, you know, and not just the direct cost of carbon. We do that already. You know, energy consumption will be savings of X. You know,
it's a very good question, and there is no easy answer to it. I mean, the accounting profession has not cracked it yet. On the group that Dave and I sat on when we were doing the fossil fuels review, we had a professor of accounting in the group and another 2 who sort of popped in because there was a specialism, and there's just no obvious answer. If there had been, I think it would have been easier to make the case. And I think what we've got to do now is we really need to innovate and find ways of making that presentation more compelling. So the amount of carbon that's used, there are people who take a view that you have to own the asset before you can do something with it and claim the carbon credits. This was a big problem in the renewable energy low carbon optimization program we were on, where we were saying, well, should we invest in a wind farm or do we need to own it? Could we lease rather than buy? And nobody's quite certain as to what the solution will be. I think it's quite a brave decision that you've made to not have any more capital expenditure until you understand the carbon, because that's a really good way of just putting a brakes on the capital program for quite a long time.
We're not stopping the capital.
Oh, you're not stopping it?
No, we're not doing it. We're not doing it.
Okay, I feel better about that now, because if you're going to wait for an answer to that one, you'll be waiting a long time. It is really tricky. Some people think, you know, the finance have all the answers in these things. I mean, the financial standards have been changing to the point now where, you know, accountants who've been in business, I mean, I've been in business for 40 years, and what they're doing to the accounting standards recently just beggars belief. You know, accountants of my age look at what we've done with financial reporting standards and think, you know, we're just when we got people understanding the difference between revenue and capital, now you've got capital stuff going into the income and expenditure account again. You know, this is not helpful. So we've got a huge number of classification, quantification issues, and carbon just happens to be one of the new ones.
Okay, great. Thanks, Phil. There was a lady at the back. And maybe we'll take 2 questions, actually. So a lady at the back, and then there was another lady at the back there too.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to ask. As Dave said, that's my opening gambit on any session I ever run. There's no such thing as a stupid question, because there's always somebody going, I wish somebody would just ask about.
So I think what we'll do, Phil, is I'll give you a chance to answer 2 at once. So if that lady asks a question, and then that one, and then you can answer both.
Thanks, Hannah James from Yorkshire Water. I think I've heard quite a lot about what you don't like to see in a business case. Can you summarise what if I were to give you an ideal business case? How long would it be? Do you want a big sheet of paper with lots of evidence, or is brevity, you know, the key?
How good a story is it? Is it spot the dog, or is it Lord of the Rings. I mean, seriously, I mean, this is why the metaphor of a story is really useful. I mean, some stories you can get across in you know, a very pithy 5-minute presentation, you know, a couple of pages, and you get there and go, God, that was really powerful. That was really... A poem is just a very short story, but you can have, you know, 20 lines in a poem, and at the end of it you go, wow. Or you get to the end of Lord of the Rings, which I think was 1,000, 1,200 pages or something. It took me a long time to read it, a long time ago. But it was absolutely gripping, and there was a completely different world created. What are you trying to achieve? Think of the reader every single time. What are you trying to achieve? How much space? And if as a broad guide, less is more. Particularly when you're trying to get a paper on a finance committee or an executive committee. That's one of the things I've really, really enjoyed missing. No bunch of 150 pages to read with 3 days to go. So make it the right length. It's not very helpful, that, is it? But it's true.
Can I add one thought for myself as well, which is be aware of the size of the papers in the committee that you're in. So if you're in a committee that doesn't spend much money, I was sometimes writing slightly longer papers, I thought, because people wouldn't be used to making spending decisions and there was a bit more scope. When we were at the Estates Committee, we're spending 100 to 150 million a time, and I rock up asking for $1 million. It felt to me like 1 to 2 pages was the right length, because they're dealing with something that's 50 million, and even there, I have, 10 pages or something. Yeah. So my one couldn't be this massive long thing for a relatively modest amount of money. So the context for me... So
from a practical point of view, you're right. I mean, aim for 2 pages, plus an appendix with the data or whatever. But if you... I mean, my heart used to sink when one of these came in, particularly if it's a business case by somebody who doesn't normally do it, and they just write and write and write. And you could take out about 80% of it and get to cut to the chase. What is really important? So, good guide. I mean, 2 pages. If you can tell your story in 2 pages, that's probably about right.
Thank you.
Here's your challenge.
Hello, Victoria Hans from Kingston University. I wonder if you can tell me about whole life costing, total cost of ownership, because they're 2 models that exist already, but in my experience haven't been super supportive of new technologies or indeed just basic waste management in terms of total cost of ownership. However, they seem promising. So I wonder if you can tell me if you've got any experience of that, or I know they're used in the construction industry, or if you see that they could be of use.
Okay, well, I think that's a really good question, and it's a very, very practical question. You mentioned that there are new models. There's the total cost of ownership model, there's this model. There's not. Demystify finance. All a business case is about the incremental cash flows over a period of time. That's when you cut to the chase, that's what it's all about. You're investing to make a difference. The question is, how do you quantify the difference? So that every business case will have impact on income, impact on cost, impact on cash flow, and then how the working capital balance sheet moves from year to year. And really, everything can be translated to that. So total cost of ownership, to my mind, is simply doing the cash flow properly. So you may have heard the phrase a discounted cash flow. All that says is, if I look forward year by year, what's going to happen in each of the subsequent years, as far as I can see, as a consequence of what I've done. So are we going to start doing more stuff? Are we going to stop doing stuff? It's the increment and the financial impact of the increment goes into your cash flow. So if you've got your business plan, it sets out what the position is going to be, and then you overlay that with your business case in exactly the same format, and sales will go up, or fees will go up, staff costs will go up, maybe staff costs will go down, maybe the cost of running the building will go down. Maybe in 5 years' time you've got to replace the boiler again. Maybe in 20 years' time you've got to replace the windows again. It depends how far forward you want to go, but if you're looking at a big building project and you're involving external funding, banks or whatever, they will tend to look at that long period, and they will want to see, oh, so there's a capital injection here because you're replacing this, or there's a maintenance cost, or the contract comes to an end, there's a cost of renegotiating. It's all about the increment. And I think probably one of the biggest lessons that you can take away is simply that. When you're thinking about the future, what will be different as a consequence of your story coming to pass. And it will be increments up and increments down, and they all go in. Does that help? Not as much as you'd liked.
And on whole life costing, because that is a model that's used on capital projects, have you had experience where it's worked for investment in new technology, sustainable technology?
Yeah, when just shortly after I started, we were completing the new postgraduate accommodation down in Holyrood, so that was about 1,100 beds. And there was a joint venture we were doing with Balfour Beatty. And we had, at the time, decided that Balfour Beatty would be involved in a joint venture. So the funding would go into the joint venture to pay for it, and they would run it. So they're going to be on the hook at the end of this contract for 35 years to maintain the structure. So the whole life was deemed to be 35 years. And at points, you would need to replace the lifts. You would need to fix the boilers. You would need to do various things. So when you're thinking of the whole life, it just simply means for the life of the building being up, as long as we can work it out, what is going to be the cost? And when you're dealing with somebody else, the question is, and who's going to pay for it? So we'd have a debate that said, there has to be a maintenance carried out every year so that we don't have a problem to fix in 10 years because the building's falling down because nobody was inspecting it. So that will be your cost. And, oh, no, it's your cost. No, it's your cost. So you have this debate about who pays for it. It doesn't change the fundamental that if there is a building that needs maintained, if you've built it, that's one increment. If you've got to run it, that's another increment. If it's annual maintenance, that's it. If there's a replacement in 5 years and 10 years, that's another one. So the whole life cost simply means thinking properly about the increment of putting up this building and running it for that period of time. It's not any more complicated than that. People will try and make it really complicated, but in essence, just go back to that. But it's the increment in my business case. So if you can look at the P&L just now, if you can look at the income and expenditure and you know what the costs are, just think ahead. How are they going to change over time? And if you do it properly, you can reasonably call that whole life costing.
Okay, and you can grab each other later if you want more. More questions, folks? Yeah, gentleman here. Have we got any others just now? Nope, so got one over there too. So that gentleman in the middle and then that one behind. Just middle, there he is, yep. And for a rare change, actually this is the first gentleman to ask a question, so that's quite nice, isn't it, for a change?
Boys are usually shy, though, aren't they?
Hi, morning. Matt Dunlop from Newcastle University. Can you tell us a bit more about the specifics of your involvement in the divestment issue? How did you apply a screen? How did that relate to a tender for fund managers? And who did you end up using as your fund managers to deliver a product that delivered the outcomes you were looking for from your investment?
Okay, good question. There's a few in there. The University of Edinburgh endowment, big one, it's about 300-400 million. And we've got additional cash that we had in that, which had been raised waiting for some of the capital investments. So we were looking at managing a pot of about £500 million. We had about 4 or 5 different fund managers already, and the university had them for the 30 years that they'd used them. Baillie Gifford was the biggest one, based in Edinburgh. They managed all the bulk of the equity investments, about half of it, and then we had a series of other firms. When it came to the fossil fuel debate, that simply gave priority to what the students had been saying. This is really important to us. So when the vice president was voted in, she was voted in on we're going to do something about investments. And we thought, well, that's good because we've already got negative screens in place. The university is sort of aware of what it's doing, but this would be an interesting and useful development. So we embraced it immediately when the vice president of the Students' Association started, and we set up this body to do it. When you look at the screening, there's quite a lot of firms already do it. So all of our fund managers had already signed up to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Yep. we signed up as a university in January 2013, just after I started. And it seemed to me like a very obvious thing to do, because universities are there to make the world a better place. By and large, that's our job. So in making it a better place, you should also try not to do things that make it worse. And I think it was certainly becoming clearer to me, and I was a sort of slow convert, that you really did need to think about fossil fuel use, and you really did need to think about what the long-term impact was. One of the reasons for that is that all of these issues, which are just now on somebody's agenda as how would you describe it? Sort of soft and fluffy, and it's all that sustainability mob. Actually, what you're talking about is pre-financial issues. So it's not a problem now. It will become a problem in the future, and there will be financial consequences, and we're now starting to see that. So the approach we took was, let's try and work out what the pre-financial position is of these investments. And it was clear to me that the fossil fuel investment was not a long-term sustainable financial position to be in. There was a question yesterday about USS and why they've got so much invested. I think that's a bloody good question. And I was at a USS presentation where one question was allowed, and it was all sort of staged. And the fund the guy who's in charge of the fund, this was several years ago, he said in response, it's not our issue, we're just here to make money for the pensioners. Oh, God, that is such a short-sighted approach. It really is. Now, on the one hand, he was right because he was trying to maximise the financial return. But in the long term, some of these assets are going to be quite damaging. And I do think that from an investment point of view, if you as an organisation really believe in all the positive things that universities do, then to have something, a materially large investment in a fossil fuel business, which is probably going to change over time, then there's a little bit of, there's a sort of cognitive dissonance between the two. On the one hand, we're trying to do this. On the other hand, we're not doing it. So we were trying to manage that position and look at the different approaches. So although we had this very large investment, we put in negative screening for those, and back to the question about carbon, how do you measure it? There is no reliable set of indicators. So we just used the indicator that had the carbon 200 polluters, the worst, most egregious examples of brown coal, which is the worst emitter, and then various other activities that increase greenhouse gas emission. And we simply took the top and said, if you're in the top 10 of this list, then you probably shouldn't be, so what are you going to do to get out of it? So as a proxy for a really well-considered, careful analysis, if you're in the top 10, we probably don't want to invest in you. And as a consequence, we immediately divested from 3 companies. We wrote to 3 companies that we intended to divest from, and we had another 6 that weren't up the high polluter list, but we were going to keep an eye on them. So the 3 that we wrote to, I think it was Shell, BHP, and Rio Tinto. And we wrote a letter to them explaining what our approach was, that there's no hard and fast rule, but this is the approach. And as a consequence of that, they didn't come back in the time that we'd allotted, so we divested 3 of them, and we had put the others on watch. But over time, we gradually reduced the holdings in those companies, mostly because they weren't seen as a good long-term financial investment. Not for a sort of holier than thou, point of principle. And I think that's the important point, that in the longer term, what appears to be a point of principle might actually turn out to be the right financial decision. And if you can blend the two together, you get a much, much more powerful argument. So that's the approach we took on those. We then flipped to being more positively invested. So I didn't want to have just negative screening, I wanted to make a difference. So if I get 500 million sitting there, I don't just want a financial return. If possible, I'd like to make it work harder to do good as well. So we reallocated 60 million into Stewart Investors and Mercer, who were running funds on positive companies who positively managed their carbon footprint, who had the metrics, who explained what they're doing in their annual report. And I think that, in the long term, will prove to be a good result as well.
One quick follow up for me from a Director of Sustainability point of view, and it was great to have Phil's support, is it felt like a bit of a loaded dice to be handed the investment stuff to think about when you've just arrived in the university. But actually, by being involved in the finance, so the investment things, it builds some credibility there. It bleeds across into other areas because people felt that you had some understanding of these issues, and it certainly didn't harm my cause at all that we divested from coal, and then about 6 months later, coal price collapsed and saved us several million quid. So that was quite handy. There was somebody over here, I think, wasn't there? Yeah.
Keith Thomason from University St Andrews. There's been lots of good talk on carbon targets, but I think, flipping it back, we're going to have to innovate a lot to achieve some of these targets, and we're going to expect our supply chains to innovate. But with innovation also comes risk. How much, or do you think it's appropriate that universities take that risk when, particularly when it comes to estates, staff and students, the expectation is tried and tested? So first of all, do you think it's appropriate, or how much of that the universities should shoulder versus their supply chain? And secondly, in terms of a business case, what would convince you on a project that had risk involved in it to invest?
Okay, great question. My favourite definition of business is controlled risk-taking. You know, you're in. If you don't want any risk, stick your money in the bank and walk away, and just drop in when you need it. If you're trying to create something or do something different, you have to take a chance. You have to take a risk. You have to invest and hope that people will buy what you're wanting to sell. So I think the whole issue of risk is worthy of a good debate in your institution. If you're not getting involved in it, you'll get involved because it's important. I think many universities are too risk averse. They're not willing to innovate and take a chance. And the whole point of innovation is you're trying something new. So it's inherently risky, but it's also inherently a good thing to do. And if you don't innovate, the chances of you making a step change and improvement is actually quite low. If you just do the same old thing, eventually something will happen and you'll get caught out. So whether you're changing and innovating in response to something, so there's a reaction, or you're proactively trying to do it, it's the right thing. So on risk generally, I am a risk seeker because that's where the returns are. And those returns are in financial capital, intellectual capital, human capital, relationships, the whole range. It's not just about finance. If I'm talking about investing resources, it's not just money. If I'm looking for a return, it's not just a financial return. I'm thinking about the whole position. So looking at your supply chain, if you're going into your supply chain saying we want to do something differently, then you have a discussion with suppliers, and you'll find, I hope, that the suppliers who are the good ones will want to innovate with you. You'll find probably they're saying, gosh, thank goodness you've asked, because we've had all these ideas and we didn't find anybody at university to talk to them. I was talking to one of the suppliers outside an exhibition. It's exactly the same. They've got great ideas, they want to get in, they can't get in. So I think full marks for looking at the supply chain. Definitely find out from them what they want to do. But do it. It's not. I'm not encouraging you to take an uncontrolled risk. I'm not encouraging you to take a risk and just close your eyes, stick a pin in it, and hope it works. You take on the one hand it's this, on the other hand it's that. Now, what's my best route through this? What are the options and what are the consequences? And if you do that properly, you will almost certainly come up with a good solution.
Can I give an example? Phil, I felt very fortunate we had a spell of working together on investments, and as Phil said, we started with divestments, we moved on to these positive investments, but we both wanted to do something about social investments, the idea that if this is a grant and this is traditional business, there's something in the middle which is focused on doing social good, but it's still a commercial entity. And what was great was that I think what you described, Phil, is what we actually did. So I came along with this idea, and you're like, I want to do the same, but that doesn't work. That's not controlled risk-taking. That's just daft, really. So we worked together, I think, with Phil's insight to come up with a way in which we'd said, we want to take some of our funds and do some social good with them, but we need to put it in a framework that the university can understand and is prepared to take those risks, and we understand the level of risk we're prepared to take. And from that, it sounds a bit dull, but you can then put in place capital structures which mean that your own capital is not the first capital which is at risk, it's government capital. So we've done various projects with the Scottish Government where they put in most risk because they'd normally do a grant, but this time they're putting in capital. Then we come in behind, but that was a partnership to build. And before you know it, we're spending millions and millions on social investments that if we hadn't taken the approach that Phil was talking about, we wouldn't have got anywhere, really. So I would have sort of waved my hands around as a Director of Sustainability saying, it would be good to do these worthy things. But I think the bit that I found really helpful was Phil saying, oh, that's all fine, but actually that's not controlled risk-taking.
So, back to your, I didn't quite finish your question on, so what would you put in the business case? Well, the business case just sets out, well, from where we are today, there are 3 stories that could emerge. One is that we just keep doing what we're doing, and that's pretty dull, and we think this is the route. We could do something completely radical, and we think this is what will happen, but here's the benefits and the costs. And here's another route, and we think that's the one. So an options appraisal that shows a pretty objective upside, downside, what are the key assumptions I'm making, what could go wrong, but actually what's the upside. And by the time you get to the end of that analysis, the chances are you will have convinced yourself what the right approach is. And by doing that, you can then convince others with that evidence.
Okay, yeah, so we're beginning to the last few minutes. We've got a question from Emma. Are we going to... We've got 2, one from Pat. So we'll take those 2 and then we may be out of time, folks. Although I would point out to the organisers that we did start slightly late, so maybe they could... So Emma at the front and then Pat at the back.
Thanks, Emma Gardner from the University of Manchester. So on the pathway kind of like to zero carbon, we're going to have to think differently and more innovatively about how we fund the carbon projects. And I just wondered what your ideas and thoughts on kind of different, more innovative models that we could maybe take to our financial director.
I was very impressed with Andy Burnham yesterday. I thought he sounded very sensible. He wasn't promising the earth, he wasn't ranting, he just said, this is sensible stuff. So it's backed by as much evidence as we have available. Now, when we made the investments, the decision to get out of fossil fuel investments, as I said, we didn't have all the evidence. But you've got to get as much evidence as you can and check it for credibility. If you wait till you've got a perfect set of evidence, you'll wait for a long, long time. In fact, it may not even happen. So there is a bit about, and I liked his phrase where he said, I didn't really know, but I know it's the right thing to do. So from a political standpoint, I'm saying, this is the right thing to do. Here's the challenge. Now, can you work out how to help me get there? And that's good leadership, because it sets out a clear goal. It's not a specific target, but it's a clear goal to make a difference. And then the challenge then goes back to the people innovating. So when your project, I think Manchester sounds as if it's doing some fantastic stuff in that, notwithstanding what Professor Anderson said, it does take time to change the world. But I think you just need to look at what the leading edge on carbon reduction or building design. Do I build solar panels in? Do I build flexible windows that have a better sun screening than before? And it may be that some of that's a little bit more expensive, but it buys you more time. It gives you more options to improve for the future. So, from a capital programme, your estates director will be getting bombarded with ideas from innovative companies. Building in sensors, that's one of the things I would do. I think there's a lot on renewable energy where people just think, oh, it's wind or it's solar. Actually, energy management, having automatic lights on and off, sensors controlling which rooms get heated and not heated, you'll get huge savings if every organisation introduced better energy management. And energy storage, so batteries. I mean, there's a big battery up in Loch Awe, it's called the Cruachan Dam. And at night, when the electricity is cheap, they pump all the water up there, and it sits there like a blooming great battery until demand comes in. And during the day, when demand is up and the price starts to rise, they pump it down, and the difference is money. So that's been a kind of natural battery for a long time. Now the world is going battery mad, and there are huge numbers of them. So what are your projects doing to recognise better energy management, energy storage? Can you build energy storage into your buildings? These are the sort of innovations that I think more organisations need to start looking at.
I think as well, it's just the innovation in finding the funding. So we know we've got portfolio of projects that's going to cost us £70 million, and we've presented that, but we don't have that money, so different ways in which we could maybe fund that.
Yeah, funding. Gosh, we could talk for a long. I should come down again. We could talk for funding for hours. I think funding. Again, there is an obsession with funding and trying to. Well, I'm doing this sort of project, so I need that sort of funding. The approach which I took, and I was very fortunate to inherit a balance sheet that had a lot of cash in it, but we weren't spending it. We weren't investing. So we had the estate, you know, some of which was built hundreds of years ago. Literally, bits were falling off it. It was quite dangerous, so we had to spend £6 million just to stabilise the top of McEwan Hall. But the investment approach I took was separate what you're trying to do, separate how you're going to pay for it. So first of all, what am I going to do? So your strategic plan, put together by the governors and the executive group, should say this is where the university is going. Here we are, that's where we're going. Now, what do we need to do to get there? And it might involve a couple of buildings, it might involve recruiting new people, it might involve spending some money. So work out what it is you're trying to do. Once you're convinced that that looks right, think about where the money is going to come to pay for it. And a large chunk of it should come from the operational cash flow. And the operational cash flow is essentially the difference between what you bring in and what you spend. That is going to fund your activities. It has to fund your funding as well. So funding is simply a loan. And does anybody here own a house or took out a mortgage, or maybe you bought a car? You know, if you've done that, that's all. Company finance isn't that much more tricky than that. There's some rinky-dinks to it, but in essence, you borrow money and you've got to pay for it out of your operating cash flow. So the innovation that you're looking for should be, if the university is trying to achieve its objective, and it's got this amount of money to spend, where does your project, your 70 million, sit in the 120, 150 million a year that Manchester will be spending? Where does it sit? So it's not, can I find funding for that specifically? It's where does it rank in the importance of things that need funding? Because at that scale, and the way we did, I mean, I raised, much did I raise? 500 million over the 6 years from different sources. But I wanted a pot of money at the cheapest I could get it, for the longest I could get it, with the most favourable payment terms, and then I'll decide what am I going to spend it on. And some of it will be stuff that doesn't give you a big financial return, some will give you a huge financial return, some will give you a very, very big sustainability, green factor return, some none. So it's all about a portfolio of investment. You'll find something like...
There, Phil, because I'm conscious of time.
Oh, sorry,
I want to get
I did say
one more question in from Pat. I suggest that Emma grabs you just after.
Yeah, sure.
Actually, because debt raising in the private market is fascinating. So last question to Pat.
Thanks.
And then we'll finish.
Pat Meegan from University College Cork. And my question relates to your capital programme, and it's kind of two parts. It's how do you measure the success of your projects when people present a financial case? And during the project, how do you ensure that those things that you promise to be delivered from a sustainability point of view don't fall off the agenda when people get into the project to deliver the building on time and on budget?
Brilliant question again. How do you make sure that people say what they're going to deliver, promise what they're going to deliver, and then track it? I introduced what I call a post-implementation review. So if you've got a capital programme with maybe 30 projects on it, you would set out very clearly and consistently for everyone what the business case is, what the metrics are that people are going to promise. And then somebody will have signed it, somebody saying, I'll put my hand up to deliver this. So we go back after the building's completed, mostly capital projects and buildings, and say, so what happened? I mean, did you finish on time? Did you deliver in budget to the right standard? And then we might pick one and go back 2 years later, 3 years later, and say, let's look at the business case promises, let's see what actually happened, and try and understand. So this is not, and I had to keep saying this, this is not about coming in to try and catch you out. It's not about trying to say, oh, you said you would deliver 10 and you delivered 8. Oh, you're in for a real hiding. No, this is about learning. So if that was the best set of assumptions you could make when we signed off this business case and it didn't happen, what was that? Be curious. Understand what caused it, because that will improve the quality of assumptions going into the business case for the next project. So make sure that there's metrics in there that are to be managed, make sure there's somebody who's signed up to deliver them, and then check when the building is just going operational, and check again selectively on a sort of random basis, maybe 2 or 3 years after that, and then do that as a rolling programme.
Thank you, Phil. We need to leave it there. I could see there were more questions, but we've run out of time. I'm sure Phil would be happy to hang around and answer further questions. I'm going to hand back to Jim, but I just want to say thank you on your behalf to Phil, because I don't know that many finance directors would be willing to come and sit for an hour and have a bunch of slightly scary sustainability people fire questions at him. So on your behalf, can I say thanks to Phil? And can I hand back to Jim?